into the book of Samuel. We've been there for a few weeks. I think this is like sermon 5 or week 5. We've been in Samuel. And I thought, okay, this week, man, we're biting off a bigger chunk because we've kind of, moved in some little sections. And then I get to verse 1 of chapter 3 and the wheels fall off for me. So we're going to be in verse 1 of chapter 3. And so that's really what we're going to cover today is verse 1 of chapter 3. And so here's what it says. And if you've read it, then hopefully you also read this and thought, man, that's significant. But here's what it says. The boy Samuel served the Lord in Eli's presence. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare, and prophetic visions were not widespread. And so I read that, I was like, oh my goodness. I realize that's introductory information, and it's going to be setting the stage because Samuel's about to hear from God, and that's a rare thing. And so, the writer's setting the stage here for what's about to happen, and why, he wouldn't know what's happening, and it's understandable. But we can't read past that and just overlook that and think, oh, okay, so the word of the Lord was rare, so what's next? No! This is big deal stuff. The word of the Lord was rare. And prophetic visions were not widespread. This is not something that's happening. Israel's not having that right now as a nation. And, imagine if the text said, and water was rare. You're like, oh, well, that's a big deal. I mean, if you don't have water, you die, right? And y'all know the theory of 3, you can go 3 minutes maximum without air, 3 days maximum without water, 3 weeks maximum without food. As Baptists, maybe it's 6 weeks, but normally it's 3. We could go a little longer without food probably. But, if we read, hey, the water was rare, then we'd understand, hey, the people's going to have to do something. You can't continue like that. You're not going to be okay in that situation. And yet, the question is the word of God as critical as water? David knew that. He understood because he prayed, he sang, he wrote, as the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. And so David understood, man, God is as critical to my life as water is to the life of any creature. But here's the question. We read this, it's like, okay, in those days, the word of the Lord was rare. The question has to be, and hopefully you're asking this on some level, why? Why was the word of the Lord rare? And Scripture doesn't give it to us right there in that particular context of chapter 3. But we know, both by looking back and looking forward, we know the answer to this. Do you remember we were in the book of Judges for about 25 years? You remember that? We were there for a minute. And we covered part of the cycle of the life of the nation of Israel. And so in chapter 2 of Judges, we'll put it on the screen. Here's what it says, verse 11 and 12. The Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight. They worshiped the Baals and abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers who had brought them out of Egypt. They went after other gods, the surrounding people, and they bowed down to them, and they infuriated the Lord this way. That was Judges chapter 2, and it repeats that again in chapter 3, and chapter 4, and chapter 6, and chapter 13. And this was the cycle of a nation. God wasn't referring back to it in all those chapters. It was basically happening again. And again, it says, the people did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And again, the people did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And so here's the cycle. The people would drift away from God. And I'm sure it wasn't an overnight thing. It was a slow thing. It's just a slow fade. And they drift away from God, and they get into other stuff, and they start worshiping other gods. And so God sends leanness to them, and God sends other nations to oppress them. And then they're like, oh man, we're not doing so well. We should turn to God. And so they turn back to God, and they pray to Him, and they worship Him. And then God sends them a judge who will lead the nation both in military and spiritually. And this judge kind of sets them free from the oppression militarily, from the whatever nations come against them, and he also brings them toward freedom spiritually, away from the bondage of idolatry. And so that's the cycle. They disobey God, they walk away from God, they turn to idols, God sends a nation to oppress them, and they cry out to God, and God sends a judge to deliver them, and then the cycle starts all over again. Everything's good for a little while. During the life of the judge, whichever it was, usually everything's good for a little while, and then it starts all over. They begin to just kind of revert back to their old ways, and they cycle back toward their idolatry, and they start looking at the nations around them and wanting to be like the world. And next thing you know, they're right back where they were, and God sends leanness again, both spiritually and physically, with the oppression of other nations. And then they cry out again, and then God sends a judge, and the judge delivers them, and they come back to God, and the cycle repeats. 7 different times just in the book of Judges. And so we turn to 1 Samuel, and maybe you don't realize this, but Samuel is the last judge of Israel. He's actually one of the judges. It seems like maybe he's a priest, but he's also the judge, and you'll see that looking ahead. And in fact, chapter 7 gives you a lot of the details of what's going on right here, but I don't want to get too far ahead of us. I think Billy might be preaching chapter 7, hadn't you? I don't recall. He was asleep back there at the sound booth. Don't worry about him. He's fine. I woke him up. Sorry, buddy. Anyway, so that's kind of the cycle that Israel is in. And so when you ask the question, why is the word of the Lord rare? And why is there no prophetic vision? And what is causing all this? God has told us why. Idolatry. It's idolatry. And it's the same scenario that we have in our own lives. It's idolatry. We return back to worshiping idols. Now, for us, it's not necessarily bound down to wooden instruments or golden altars. You know, for them, they had all these various things and the Asherahs and the Baals that they would be drawn toward because the other nations were doing that, and they wanted to be like the other nations. And so that was kind of their Achilles heel and the thing that kept sucking them back in and tripping them up. For us, really, idolatry for us is the worship of self. That is our primary idol that we continue to go back to. It's the worship of self. And, you know, our financial goals or our pleasure or our children. You can worship your children. It's and so some idea of self is really where we come to when it comes to idolatry. And it's a cycle that we're also on in our lives. And we often, just like the nation of Israel, we often need that reset where we come to realize, hey, I've kind of drifted away from God and I've put the attention on me. I've put the focus on me and what I want and what I like and my pleasure and my preferences and my people. And it's kind of all been about me. And if we're not careful, even God is going to exist for me rather than me existing for him. And Israel had gotten there. And if you keep reading the chapter a little bit further ahead, you know, the oppression happens and the Philistines come and they set up to go to war. And Israel goes out to fight them and they lose like 6,000 people. And then they come back and they're thinking on this thing. He's like, you know what we did wrong? We didn't take the Ark of the Covenant with us. We didn't have on our cross necklace. You know, we didn't, rub the head. I don't know, some type of religious thing. It wasn't relationship. And so now they think, all right, we're going to use God this time. Instead of worshiping God, it's like he's a token. And so let's take the ark with us. We'll go back out and fight them again. And everybody got excited about that. And roars went up and they're screaming and hollering, woo, we're going to win this time. And the Philistines here, it's like, oh man, we killed 6,000 and they got excited. I was like, so the Philistines a little bit nervous, like, well, we don't know what to do. We'll go out and fight again tomorrow. They go out and fight the Israelites the next day, and they killed 30,000 of them. And that was a turning point. So I just got ahead of myself. I just preached like 3 sermons right there. Well, you can come back next week. It's like, turn to chapter 10. And so they're using God to serve them. Basically, it's like, hey, this thing's not working out for us. Let's bring a little God. Add a little God in the mixture. It's like, hey, my job's not paying me what I want. I'm going to add a little God in the mixture. My relationship's not working out. I'm going to ask God to step in and fix this for me. And we begin, if we're not careful, we begin to use God in the worship of us. And it's idolatry. And so you think, well, man, that's how it happens right there. This leanness of the soul, this leanness spiritually, this spiritual famine is all part of idolatry. And we deal with the same thing on a cycle, just like Israel. We think, man, these people are so stupid. You read these stories like, man, they're crazy. Why would they do that again? And we do the same thing. We cycle in and out all the time. We're tempted to blame everybody else. You know, when we read the story of Hophni and Phinehas and the sons of Eli, if you were here the last few weeks, you realize, man, these guys were a train wreck for God's temple. This was like, you could not have gone out and found worse people to be given oversight of this job, and they're really messing it up. And for sure, they are part of the problem. They are not part of the solution. We can read their story and realize, yes, but they are not each person's problem. They are their own problem. And, it's kind of like, if you're a person, you're blaming the leadership, right? And if you're leadership, you're blaming the people. And this is kind of how life runs all the time. It's funny how that happens. And they are part of the problem. And God tells them so. If you go back in chapter 2 and we get to verse 28, we didn't cover it last week and we're trying to get, to chapter 3 right now. But if you go back to verse 28 of chapter 2, you realize, okay, God had entrusted to them something precious. And he calls them out and he sends a prophet to Eli and says, hey, when I brought you out of Israel, I called your crew out. Your tribe was given the highest honor of all the tribes. You get to worship before me. You get to serve before me. You get to help lead the nation to me. You've got the top honor out of all the nation. I entrusted that to you. This thing that is precious, this thing that is beautiful, I've given it to you to care for, and you've messed it up. I mean, you've blown it. And then God says, hey, in verse 31 through 33, is like, the days are coming. I'm going to cut you off. Your strength and the strength of your ancestral family. And he goes on to tell Eli that I am coming down on you and I'm going to... It sounds like something out of a Liam Neeson movie. It's like, I've developed a certain set of skills. And I will find you. And I will kill you. And your families. That's what God says. I mean, he didn't use the part about find you. He knew where he was. But he's like, I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to kill all your people. He's like, there's not one of you that's going to live to be an old age, and you're going to die a violent death. I'm like, whew. This is God. This is not Hollywood. This is God saying, I'm going to kill all your people violently. Nobody's going to live to be an old age. They're going to die early, and they're going to die bad. Well, I've been afraid before. You had some fearful moments in life. Can you imagine God saying that to you? Here's what's going to happen to you. You're going to die. Your sons are going to die in the same day. And everybody in your family is going to die early and violently. The God of all of creation saying that's what's coming. I'd be like, just can we kill me now? Can I go ahead and hop on that train? I don't know if I want to stand around and wait for this to happen. That sounds awful. And that's what God says to them. This thing is going to happen because you so mistreated this thing that was so precious. And it's and we don't have a lot of ways to relate to that. You just have to understand that God held the worship, obviously still does, in such high esteem. It was such a precious thing, and it was such a privilege for them to be invited to care for this precious thing. Imagine if you had, a 6-month-old puppy, and you had to go out of town for a month, and you called me up and say, hey, Randall, I want you to watch my puppy. I hear you got some dogs. I do. And it's like, can you watch my puppy for me? Okay. And you go out and you're gone a month and you come back and you can tell the dog has been mistreated and malnourished and, it can't see out of one eye now and it's hopping around, one of its legs don't work and this thing looks like it's been beaten every day of its life and it is just the worst looking scenario you've ever seen in your life. How are you going to feel about me at that point? And that's just a dog. And God says, look, I've entrusted the worship to you of a nation and you guys have mistreated it. You've abused it. And so now, it's on. And I'm sure, again, people were blaming the leadership that, hey, we haven't heard a word from God. And, those pastors up at the church, they don't know nothing. And they couldn't find a word from God if it's in the tub with 2 hands. And so, that's how it goes. And I'm sure the leadership was blaming the people. And the reality is, here's the reality, that both had abandoned God in pursuit of something else, in pursuit of something that they felt was more important. And when that happens, the word of the Lord becomes rare. And when I say the word of the Lord, I don't mean that the letters will start disappearing from the pages, the ink's not going to rub off. I'm saying that intimate word of God, we're going to miss it. That those moments where we really feel like that we're connecting with the heart of God and we feel the joy and the passion and the peace and the love that comes from real intimacy with God, we're not going to feel that. We're not going to find that. That's going to go missing and it's going to be rare. Whenever we start drifting into idolatry, to worship of self in some way, then that intimate connection with God becomes rare for us. That unmistakable, inaudible voice of the Lord that comforts us and corrects us, that teaches us, that instructs us and encourages us. And if you've been a Christian for any length of time, you've probably been through a chapter or two where you felt that, where hey man, I know what the mountaintop feels like. I've experienced how great it is to really just connect with God on an intimate, emotional, mental, spiritual level. For to come to him every day and be excited to be in his presence, to open his word and get excited because he's speaking to me regularly. And if you've been a Christian any period of time, then you know what it feels like to have that. And it is exciting. And you also probably know what it feels like to not have that. To wonder sometimes, why is my devotion time so dry? Why is it that I'm not hearing from God like I used to? And God says, hey, here's why. Because the focus has become something else. You're drifting toward idolatry. A crowd this size, I'm sure there are some who are there right now. You remember the sweetness, the passion, the joy that you once had through this intimate relationship with God, but if you're honest, perhaps like right now, you don't have that. Or maybe it's been a while since you've had that. And it's not that you don't want it. You do. You desperately want to feel that again. You just want to be that close to God again. But maybe like Israel, that kind of intimacy has become rare, and you just didn't know why. And so God is telling us today, here's why. Because you have drifted towards self. Ultimately, it's idolatry. For all of us, it's ultimately the same thing. Worshiping ourselves, our financial goals, our comfort, our pleasure. And we'll dress it up, we'll call it humanitarianism, we'll call it family-oriented, and it's still fast-track to spiritual famine. So here I want to give you 3 realities this morning for spiritual famine. I know it feels like that was all introductory, right? Whew, hope you packed a lunch. No, this is going to go fast from here. We're on the downhill side. It's 3 realities for spiritual famine that these are true of all of us because this is what we forget, but we know it. Here's number 1. Spiritual famine is never somebody else's fault. It's always yours. It's always mine. Whenever I'm going through leanness spiritually, it's because of me, not because of anybody else. And we want to blame other people. I mean, the very first sin, God comes to the garden and Adam's like, hey, let me tell you about this woman you gave me, God. Oof. It did not go well. She, gave me the fruit and, she tricked me. I'm like, no, she didn't. You're stupid. That's your problem. And it's been our problem, men, but it continues to be our problem. And we try to blame other people. It's, and we put our focus on them, and if they did this different, and if that was done differently, if we could do that better, then I wouldn't feel this way, and I wouldn't no, you're the problem. You are your problem. I am my problem. You're not my problem. I am my problem. Your spiritual leanness, your spiritual famine is because of you. You have drifted away from God. You can't blame other people. Well, when that person, mistreated me, it really set me in a tailspin and, it set me back some spiritually. No, it didn't. You set yourself back spiritually. I have a friend who went through a divorce some time ago. Ended up, and he is a follower of Christ. Born again Christian, involved in ministry, on a volunteer level. And when he went through his divorce, man, the wheels fell off, and he turned to drinking a lot regularly. Got out of church, got out of ministry, lost his passion, basically for God and everything for a period of time. This was his story. And, to talk to him, she messed me up and she ruined me and nothing's right. And I get it. I'm not calling him out. If I was going through that, maybe I would have the same response. I don't know. But here's what I do know, that your spiritual famine is your fault. It's not because somebody else did something. It's not because something else didn't work out. It's not because some other relationship fell through. His spiritual famine was his fault, not his ex-wife's fault, not his divorce fault. It was his fault. You don't wreck the greatest relationship you have in response to a secondary relationship. Try that on for just a second. Imagine you are best friends with the king of Saudi Arabia. He's pretty wealthy. Extremely. And y'all best friends. I mean, you've known each other a long time. He calls you on the phone. You call him. Y'all hang out together. He's always lavishing you with all these crazy gifts, and it's exciting. He invites you on vacation with him, and, he pays for everything. And it is a fantastic relationship. You're obviously the beneficiary more so than he is. It's not balanced, but it's good, right? And so imagine that's your best friend, king of Saudi Arabia. But you also have some other friends. And so one day you happen to walk in on one of your other friends, and he's on the phone, and he's talking to somebody else, and he's talking about you. And man, he is tearing you apart, and that, good, and this dirty thing, and I don't care about him, and I'm just playing, and over thing after thing, and you realize, oh my goodness, that person doesn't like me at all. I really thought we were friends, but I was wrong. They really don't like me, and they've got all these problems with me, and it's you don't address it because it's not going to solve anything. You basically go home and you sulk. And here's what you don't do. You don't tell the king of Saudi Arabia, hey, we can't be friends anymore because that person don't like me. That's stupid, right? Nobody does that. You don't stop taking his calls or going on his vacation or accepting his gifts because, somebody else fell out of fellowship with you. Somebody else disappointed you. Somebody else let you down. You don't damage the greatest relationship you got based on a secondary relationship. It's not logical, but if Jesus is not our primary relationship, then it makes more sense that whenever the wheels fall off on something else, then it wrecks everything. Here's what the reality is. Instead, here's what you would do. You would go home and you'd be upset. You'd be upset, man, I'm disappointed. I thought they liked me. I thought we had a relationship. I thought they were my friend. They were not. But you know what? I'm friends with the king of Saudi Arabia. They can kiss my grits. Right? I mean, eventually you would get to that point and you'd get there pretty quick, fast, and in a hurry because ultimately it's like, hey, I don't need you. I got the king. People, we've got a relationship with the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. A loving relationship that he desires to be with us, and he lavishes us with gifts, and he brings us on all these beautiful journeys with him, and it just doesn't make sense to part ways with that over anything else in this life. Jesus promised to never leave us nor forsake us, but he did not promise to force us. You have the ability to walk away, to drift away, to neglect the relationship, to turn your back on it. And I'm talking about loss of salvation. That's what I'm talking about, the loss of the intimacy with God, where you have spiritual famine as a result, where the word of the Lord becomes rare and you begin to miss it. And spiritual famine is never because he left us. It is always because we left him. Number one, spiritual famine is never the fault of somebody else. It's always our fault. Number two, the further you travel in the wrong direction, the more difficult the recovery. Look, all of life teaches us that. If you've operated a vehicle for any period of time at all, the sooner you know you made a bad turn, the better. Because if you go a couple hours and realize, oh man, I'm not even in the right state, that's bad. Now with the GPSs and our phones and everything, that happens rarely now, right? But once upon a time, we used to travel by map. Before that, I guess the stars. I don't know, but you remember everybody had like a Rand McNally atlas, a road map in their car, and your dads would, because it was a dad thing now at this point. Most of us, a few of you were in that era. Some of you maybe had kids in that era. I'm looking at you. It's for most of us, and even as a kid, I remember when I went to college, I had a road map. I didn't have a cell phone. We didn't have cell phones then, and I didn't have GPSs. And there was what was that first GPS? TomTom or Tomcat? Yeah. You put it in your windshield, and it would work maybe until you got to DC, and then it's like, I don't know. Yep. It's like, I think you might. This thing's talking to you. I think you probably should have turned there, but I'm not real sure anymore. It's like, try the next one. I don't know. And it would really mess you up in D.C. Everything was good until you got into D.C. It was like, you know what? I'm just going to live here. I can't find my way out. But before all that, we had, the maps. And I would remember navigating to college and with a map. And, and that was the process. Where was I going with this? Oh, yeah. And so, if you made a wrong turn. I told you it was a good one. I didn't tell you why it was good. Don't laugh with me to laugh at me. I get it. And so it's back in those days, particularly, it was more prominent to make a bad turn somewhere, and you'd be going for a ways, and finally you pull over and get your map out, like, shoo-wee, I don't really know where I am. I had that experience coming from college one time. And I had to finally pull over. I was like, man, I thought it said Highway 70, but this ain't the 70 I was looking for. Apparently there's more than one of those. But like one in every state. I was not on the right one. And it took me a minute to figure it out. You know what happens? You start traveling and you think, no, I'll see something in a little while that I recognize. And then you keep going. And then, you know, the pride kicks in. It's like, I'm certain this is right because when am I wrong? And then you keep driving. And luckily I wasn't married or, you know, I would have heard about it, I'm sure. But eventually I had to correct that thing and figure out and say, okay, so now I've got to turn here and go north about another 150,000 miles and then I'll be at the right place. But the truth is, the sooner you recognize that, hey, I made a bad turn, the easier it is to fix. And so that is the truth through all of life, and all of life teaches us that over and over, not just in driving. All of life teaches, hey, the sooner I recognize that I made a mistake, the better. The sooner I fix that, the sooner I turn around, the easier the recovery becomes. So maybe God is telling you this morning, turn around. Through His Word, through the sermon, through friends, through various life events, God continues to tell us that whenever we move in the wrong direction, we feel it. And look, we know this from even Scripture. You get over to the book of Acts, and we get to the conversion of the Apostle Paul. And remember, he's going to Damascus, and there's a bright light, and he falls into the ground, and Jesus is talking to him and saying, hey, isn't it hard to keep kicking against the goad? And the goad was the thing that they would poke animals with to keep them moving in the right direction. And instead of moving in the right direction, you know, Jesus gives us the image of him, you know, fighting against it, and it's painful. And so Jesus said, hey, it isn't even life itself teaching you that you're going the wrong way. You continue to meet this resistance over and over again, and finally you're going to have to come to the conclusion, hey, I got to turn around. I've been living like this and for this and in this direction and in this way and in this mindset for so long. But the sooner you turn around, the easier the recovery. The longer you wait, the more difficult the recovery. Deborah Acey was warned not to drink. She already had a problem with drinking. Everybody knew it. She had already had an accident while drunk. People knew that. She said, hey, man, you probably shouldn't drink. She drank anyway. You probably should stop. She kept going. You probably shouldn't drive. She got in her car and drove. Refused all the warnings from her friends, from the law, and then she passed a warning sign that said, wrong direction, do not enter. And then she passed another one that said, wrong direction, do not enter. And she ignored all the warnings and entered the interstate going the wrong direction. Continued to drive. And if at any point in time she had stopped and recognized, hey, I see the sign God has given me. I see the sign. I'll turn around now. At any point in time, if she had stopped and turned around, her recovery would have been simple, but she didn't. She continued, and she ran headlong into oncoming traffic and killed another person, 21-year-old Aaron Klotz. And now the path of recovery will be decades. Deborah had to leave her 12-year-old son and her 11-year-old daughter and go do 9 years in prison. When she gets out of jail, her kids will be 20 and 21. And we hear that story and, you know, we realize the tragedy, the loss. And we can appreciate the heartbreak and the guilt on all sides. And even from Deborah, who's done the crime, who's done this thing, we can appreciate her thought of if I had only. But now, a life ruined, lives ruined. Kids without their mother, parents without a daughter. Lives ruined because just ignored the warnings that kept on. Turn around. Turn around. Don't take that next step. Don't take that next whatever it is. And we can appreciate it from her perspective, but how about spiritually? When God says, hey, you're going the wrong direction. Turn around. And we can understand from Deborah and her loss, and we can empathize with that, but spiritually, what's the loss? It's the same. Time and tragedy. That's what it turns into. Time and wreckage. The longer we go in the wrong direction, that is the more of the outcome. Loss of time and life wreckage. further you go, the more difficult the recovery. Turn around now. Confess now. Repent now. Get it right now. Go a new direction today. That's the word of the Lord, both to them then and to us now. Number 3, and we're done. Most people require pain to change. It's not somebody else's fault. Your spiritual famine is your fault. You've done this to yourself. And the further you continue in this direction, the harder the recovery. And for most people, that turning point has to be painful. You ask people, and you should take a survey. Now, we talked about the nation of Israel. What turned them? Well, they just lost 34,000 people and the Ark of the Covenant. The Philistines took that from them too. And so, yes, okay, they're at an all-time low. Boy, they have lost some stuff. These people have been beat, and so they're at the bottom right now. So this is the turning point for them. But for most people in all areas of life, the turning point for us typically requires pain. You ask somebody, well, when did you quit smoking? Well, when I felt like I was coughing up my lung. It's like, oh no, he's going to preach on smoking. I'm not preaching on smoking. I'm just giving you life events. People say, well, change. I had somebody tell me this week, well, yeah, I had some episodes where I couldn't breathe. And, I had been smoking a long time. And after the second time, I felt like I couldn't breathe. And there's something going on. I had this episode, didn't I? I gave it up. Other people, I tell you what, when my grandfather stopped smoking? When they took his first lung with cancer. And the doctor told him, you got 10 years if you don't smoke anymore. And so he quit smoking, and he lived exactly 10 years until the cancer came back in the other lung. And there was nothing they could do for him then. That's when he quit, when it hurt. Drinking, I talked to a friend this week, said, hey, I quit drinking whenever I blew my life up. And I remember sitting there, and I was in the middle of a nightmare. Parents didn't want me. Fiance, they can't be worse than the flag right there. Fiance didn't want me. It was like my friends were done with me. It's like, and I actually just I felt like I had ruined my life with alcohol. And he said, and that was the turning point. I had basically lost everything. And I realized then, hey, this is it. When did you start working out and start eating right? Well, after I had my first heart attack. And then, I drifted off and had my second one. Then I got right again. And there's people with stories like that. And so in all these walks of life, we use it because they're somewhat comical, but the reality is for most of us, to actually change direction requires pain. We've got to hurt. We've got to lose something. So when I ask you this morning, when did you get right with God? You get to finish that one today. And you have a choice, and you can be like a lot of other people and ignore the warning signs. And that's what sermons are, and that's what friends do, and that's what, the resistance of life is about, is God's warning signs. Hey, you can't keep going this direction. So when I ask you this morning, when did you get right with God? You've got an option. You can be like so many, and it's like, well, when I hit rock bottom, when I had no peace, when I had no hope, no joy, when I had no other prospects, when in a pit of my own making, I was unsure if I would ever be the same again. That's when I finally got right with God. Or don't miss this, or today you can say, I got right with God today. You can say, I got right with God today. Book of Hebrews says, today is the day. Today, if you hear the voice of God, do not harden your hearts. Run to Him so that you can experience revival in your soul, so that you don't experience the leanness. Run to Him so that you can experience that intimacy again, the richness of hearing His voice. Today, if you hear the voice of God, do not harden your hearts. Today, if you recognize, hey, I've been moving in the wrong direction, then today you can turn around. You can lay it all out before God now. You can bring it to His altar today and say, hey, God, I've been living for myself. I've been wrapped up in my world. It's all been about me. It's my emotions or my relationships or my finances or my children or my whatever. Pleasure. And I understand that's idolatry. And because of it, I've been missing the intimacy with you that I so desire, that I remember having once upon a time, and I want it back, God. And today, I want to put it at your altar and say, I'm leaving it here. I'm turning from sin and self, and I'm turning to you. I'm turning around today. Have you stand with me? Heads bowed and eyes closed. Josh is going to play, and they may sing. I'm not sure what the invitation is going to be, but I'm opening up for you to move to the altar this morning. And we're not collecting names or filling out forms, but today, if you want to leave your seat and walk down here and get on your knees before God and say, God, today I'm turning it around. Today, Lord, I'm leaving it here. Today, I'm making a change. I'm surrendering to you. Today, God, I want to experience intimacy with you.